Hello, I'm David Frost from Hartscombe Network. I'm also Emeritus Fellow at Wolfson College, Cambridge, and I want to talk to you today about school leadership. I want to explore school leadership, but particularly the challenge of ensuring that the school is an environment in which non-positional teacher leadership can flourish, because that's what I'm interested in, promoting non-positional teacher leadership. First, let's be clear about what leadership is. From the literature, if you take an education source, such as Leithwood and Reel, we have the idea of providing direction and exercising influence. If you take a source from a non-educational study, the organisational studies field, Yuckel is a classic text. He said, "A process whereby intentional influence is exerted over other people to guide, structure and facilitate activities and relationships in groups or organisations." Okay, so what else might we learn from looking at the literature? So in order to explore what we can learn from the literature, I'd like to briefly explore 6 dimensions of educational leadership. Dimension 1, leadership and transformation. Dimension 2, leadership as practice. Dimension 3, leadership and learning. Dimension 4, leadership and culture building. Dimension 5, leadership as a distributed phenomenon. And Dimension 6, teacher leadership. So let's look at Dimension 1, leadership and transformation. Now, the research tells us that leadership does make a difference and it can be measured. So there are studies which will show you the effect size of different approaches to leadership. That's good to know, but we need to make choices about what kind of leadership really works. And transformational leadership is what we really need, and that's what research indicates. Transformational leadership is different to transactional leadership. So transactional leadership is about intervening to maintain the stability of the organisation. So where there's a problem, for example, the school principal might go to sort out that problem, to talk to this individual and something like that. But with transformational leadership, it's more about building capacity through vision building, direction setting, organisational restructuring, culture building, staff and curriculum development, and so on. So it's about changing the organisation, changing the environment, creating the conditions. And as Leithwood and Jancy say, crucially, what you get with transformational leadership are higher levels of personal commitment to organisational goals. Isn't that what every school principal wants? For more teachers to be more committed to what the organisation is trying to achieve. Can I suggest that we now take a few minutes to reflect and have a discussion perhaps about the extent to which leadership brings about change and improvement in your school. Perhaps also consider how it builds capacity for change and improvement in the future. Dimension 2 then, leadership as practice. Now, of course, you may have a formal position. School principal is a formal position, but it is just a resource. We can't depend on it. What really counts in the end is the actual practice of leadership. So what do we mean by leadership practice? Well, it involves, for example, things like influencing and inspiring others. It involves taking the initiative, setting direction, offering support and service to others, holding others to account, modelling good learning behaviour, valuing and encouraging helpful behaviour. This is the sort of thing that leadership is about. This is what we do when we exercise leadership. And of course, this capacity to do these kinds of things can be developed, and it can be exercised by anyone, whether or not they have a position, because they are behaviours. Let's reflect on what I've just said about leadership as practice. And if leadership is simply practice, then the implication is that anyone can exercise leadership because it's about the practice rather than your role in the school. So consider who in your school exercises leadership at the moment, and how do they do it? What are their behaviours? And is there scope for developing such leadership practice in your school? Dimension 3 then, leadership and learning. What's the relationship? So in classrooms and within the school as a whole community, we have to see the connection between leadership and learning. In America, they have tended for many years to talk about the idea of school principals needing to engage in instructional leadership. This is what you find in the literature. I find this difficult because I'm British. So instructional leadership is very American. They talk about instruction when we would talk about teaching and learning in our country. So in Cambridge, we developed a way of thinking about leadership for learning, LFL, in which we foregrounded these key concepts of human agency and moral purpose. We developed a set of principles with many colleagues from around the world. Things like shared leadership is a principle, shared accountability is a principle, having a dialogue about leadership for learning throughout the school. This is a basic principle. So you can read about this if you want, but these are the kinds of principles that we talked about. And we developed this diagram, which we called the wedding cake, which I shall try to explain to you now. The wedding cake, the idea is to suggest layers, that learning takes place at all levels. The students, of course, learn, that's kind of obvious, but also teachers learn. So there is teacher learning as well. And the school as an organisation is learning too, if things are going well. And because that is the case, then the system itself also learns. In other words, at all levels, there is constant learning where we learn new ideas, we learn to do new things, and so on. And what joins these layers? Well, what joins these layers is, of course, leadership. Leadership is what enables, for example, teacher learning to take place in such a way that student learning is improved. And leadership enables the school itself to learn from everything the teachers are learning, and so on. You can see the idea, I'm sure. So on the subject of leadership and learning, let's have some reflection and discussion about the link between the practice of leadership and what actually takes place in classrooms in your school. Dimension 4 then, leadership and culture building. This is really crucial. Edgar Schein, a US researcher, organisational studies guy, said the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. The unique talent of leaders is their ability to work with culture. When he used the word leaders, he meant leaders at the top, the CEO, that type of thing. But he was really challenging the leaders of organisations to think about culture building, which is the main thing they should be worried about. So the professional culture, what do we mean by that? I believe it's the dominant values, beliefs and norms of behaviour. And as a school principal, we need to think about what we are doing to develop that professional culture. So senior leadership teams can change the structures of the organisation in order to lever changes in the culture. Perhaps that's not part of the Kazakhstan tradition, but I suggest it perhaps needs to become more significant in the future. And senior leaders can adopt strategies that enable others to contribute to culture building, because it isn't just the school principals that can make a difference to cultures, it's everybody else in the school too. Now here's an interesting example of culture building. A story told to me by Val Hill, one of our HeartsCam tutors, and when she was assistant head teacher at Birchwood High School, they used to run what they called Feel Good Week, where all members of staff during that week were invited to send in an email to say something nice about a colleague. They did it anonymously. So the comments that they sent in were then passed on to the person who was being complimented. And many of those would then respond to everybody on the staff in an email saying, "Thank you so much, whoever you are. It really made me feel better." And another example of an activity in Feel Good Week was where the teaching staff made the coffee and the biscuits and so on for the canteen staff, who of course are the people who normally do the opposite for the teachers, just to say thank you for all their hard work. So you see there in the photograph, there's Val Hill on the right, and next to her is Tracy Gaetieri, who is also one of the MEd tutors in Hartscam, and they happen to be running a seminar on leadership in Sultan University in Kazakhstan. The other person there is the interpreter. Here's another example from Morgan's primary school. Alice Rocker, the head teacher there, which is the equivalent of your school principal, she told me this story about what she's been doing in her school. And she said she'd introduced mindfulness workshops, which are intended to build resilience and improve social capital in the school for children and teachers. And the teachers, of course, face all the usual challenges of running a school and teaching and so on, plus the pandemic. So mindfulness helps them to really be more self-aware, to focus on the moment rather than worrying so much about, you know, the tests that are on the horizon or whatever. And therefore they could attend to these crucial safety issues because, you know, we're in a pandemic, and then they need to be grounded and think about what the here and now. So a mindfulness lead was appointed. This is like a person who will specialize in mindfulness. So this person was given a post of responsibility with a salary attached to run a course on mindfulness for each of the pupils' classes alongside the usual class teacher. So that's a really interesting story. Thanks to Alice Rocker. And if you want to know more about that and her, you can look at her website that's listed there. Let's reflect then on the way leadership can build culture in your school. Consider, how does the exercise of leadership by various people in your school impact on the professional and organisational culture of the school? Dimension 5 then is leadership as a distributed phenomenon. Now in the UK, the term distributed leadership is often used by head teachers and school principals, I think probably not in a very accurate way. Sometimes they use it to mean that they have given out roles of responsibility to people, which is really delegation of decision making rather than distributed leadership. You can't really distribute leadership. It simply is distributed. If you look at what happens in a school, anything that happens in a school happens because there are many people involved making choices, choosing to do this or that, and taking action. So it really is distributed. The question is how well, and how well is that supported? You might want to see this YouTube video, which is a very helpful resource on there, in English, I'm sorry to say. So senior leaders can really maximise the leadership density, as Giovanni calls it, in which they are enabling and orchestrating leadership to maximise its effect and its coherence. So I've argued that leadership is distributed, but what the school principal does, of course, can help to build that and orchestrate that. So let's consider and discuss, how can the leadership of everyone be encouraged? How can it be enabled and orchestrated? Finally, we get to dimension 6, which is teacher leadership. Now, the term teacher leadership is a good rhetorical device, borrowed from the USA. Now, when they talked about it in the US, it's different to the way we have talked about it in the UK and in the way we talk about it in the TLK strategy. So in the USA, in the 1980s, the whole idea of a teacher leader was that they would be appointed by additional funding from the central federal government because the organisational structures in the USA was very flat. You had a principal and the teachers, and that was that. And the principals were bogged down with administration. But in the UK it was quite different. We'd already had management structures over the years, and then there was an attempt in the year maybe 2000 or so to call it middle leadership rather than management, to try to get people to think about exercising leadership, but still limited to those particular roles, of being head of department or something like that. Now in HeartsCam we talk differently. We talk about teacher leadership in a very inclusive way, and for us it's about extending all teachers' professionality so that they all develop the ability to lead change. They see that as part of their professionality, part of their role, if you like, as teachers. Just a quick word about what I mean by extended professionality. It's a way of constructing the role of teacher. So extended professionality is when a teacher sees themselves as being collegial. They're not an individual, they're part of a team. They're part of a learning community. They see themselves as agential, capable of changing the world, engaging in innovation rather than just saying, oh, things are the way they are and that's that. They are guided by principles about education and their own sense of moral purpose, rather than simply whatever the current rules are. And they discover how to improve their practice by evaluating, reflecting, reviewing, looking into their practice. So they're always pursuing the idea of how can I get better at my practice. And of course they create professional knowledge through leading development work and through networking with each other. And crucially, they seek to influence others within the school by exercising leadership. So I've argued the benefits of teacher leadership and the idea of teacher leadership as focusing on developing the professionality of all teachers and others who work in the school. So let's have some reflection and discussion now on the extent and in the ways that teachers exercise leadership in your school at the moment. So I've given you a very brief glimpse of these 6 dimensions: leadership as transformation, leadership as practice, leadership and learning, leadership and culture building, leadership as a distributed phenomenon, and teacher leadership. So what are the implications of what I've been saying about educational leadership? Let me just take you back to my very first point, my first challenge, if you like. How can we enable non-positional teacher leadership to flourish in our schools? And if we want that to happen, if we want non-positional teacher leadership really to flourish, we need strategies that will create the kind of culture in which colleagues feel recognised, valued, respected, and above all, connected to each other. In other words, where there's a high degree of social capital. And secondly, we need to empower and enable colleagues to contribute to the leadership of initiatives to develop practice in the school. So, I hope that's been of use to you. I hope that's been helpful, and I thank you for paying attention.